Qui veut noyer son chien l'accuse de la rage. If you want to drown your dog, accuse it of having rabies. This French proverb has been used by American scholar Barry Sautman to describe the West's smear campaign against northwest China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Professor Sautman first visited Xinjiang in 1999 and has returned frequently ever since. Over the years, he's seen the region's development and changes up close. In an academic study, he compared various quality of life indicators between the Uyghur population in Xinjiang versus people in the West, and his findings are very interesting. What exactly did he find? How does life in Xinjiang compare to life in other parts of the world, even in Western developed countries? Is it the hellscape some would have you believe, or is the real picture actually very different? Welcome to the special edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. To find out the real picture of what has happened in Xinjiang, I'm pleased to be joined from Hong Kong by none other than Barry Sautman, Emeritus Professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and Distinguished Professor at Tsinghua University. Professor Sautman, welcome to The Point.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So let's start with the background of what we're talking about, the situation in Xinjiang between the 1990s and 2016, to be exact. The region suffered thousands of terrorist attacks, killing a large number of innocent people and hundreds of police officers. But the situation has improved greatly ever since. It can be said that during the past decade, nearly a decade, almost none terrorist attacks ever happened. How do you assess from this result the effectiveness of China's efforts in combating terrorism, violent extremism?
Basically, the situation of terrorism has been dealt with effectively in Xinjiang. I say basically because since the end of 2016, as you noted, there has not been any significant murderous terrorist incident in the whole region. That's not to say, though, that there still are not people who want to carry out such incidents. In fact, in my recent trips to Xinjiang, I have talked to officials, policemen, etc., about that. Mm-hmm. And they have indicated that there still are groups within Xinjiang that do conspire to carry out terrorist acts, and they have managed to foil those acts. Mm. So they're doing their job in that regard. But the other job that's being done, which I think is very significant in terms of reducing the threat of terrorism in Xinjiang, is to address the root causes of terrorism. This is the official policy of the Chinese government. And what this means in practice is, of course, to reduce the gaps that have existed in Xinjiang among ethnic groups, to see to rapid development in all of its various aspects. That is, to increase employment, to increase levels of education, to further develop healthcare, etc. Mm. And if you look at statistics from, say, 10 years ago, and you compare them to those today, you can see a dramatic improvement in that regard.
Mm-hmm. You have published this paper this year titled Securitizing the Uyghurs, with a question mark, Comparative Socioeconomic Indicators in China's Approach in Xinjiang. But before we go into the specifics, what motivated you to study this particular topic, and where did you base your findings on? Where did you get the information to support your conclusions?
Well, I'm interested in this topic, of course, because of the mainstream discourse that exists in primarily the Western world, but spread from the Western world to other parts of the world about Xinjiang. And that discourse is almost entirely erroneous in terms of its empirical statements and the interpretations it gives to data and to events in Xinjiang. So I wanted to address that discourse and make a contribution to a counter narrative about Xinjiang. The way that I've gone about doing it is both through the use of documents and through fieldwork. And although there is not enough data available to we scholars about Xinjiang, nevertheless, there is some data available. And I've made use of that through not only official publications that emanate from the Chinese government, but also the many studies that have been carried out by very serious-minded Chinese scholars. China, of course, is the world center for Xinjiang studies, contrary to what some people in the West might believe about themselves. And there literally are hundreds of scholars in China who do work about Xinjiang, and they produce some very useful studies. So I make use of those studies, and of course I have visited 8 of the 14 prefectures in Xinjiang in the last 2 years. So that gave me some chance for observation, also to carry out some interviews with officials, and particularly to interact with scholars in Xinjiang.
Well, let's dive into the main comparisons you have made. As I said, quality of life indicators. I have picked some of them because of the time constraint, but I'm interested in, first of all, the life expectancy comparison, meaning the gap between ethnic differentials in countries. But by and large, if you look at the United States, for instance, white people in the US versus the life expectancy between white people in the United States and Native Americans, there is 11-year gap versus white people in the US and black people in the US. There's a 6 years difference. In Australia between Australians and Indigenous people, I mean non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, there is a gap of 10 years. In New Zealand, that gap is 7.4 years. In Gaza, that's before the Gaza destruction, it was 9 years already. Whereas in Xinjiang, the difference between the ethnic Han people, which is the ethnic majority of all over China, nevertheless, the ethnic minority, if I may put it this way, in terms of population in Xinjiang, the gap in life expectancy between the Han people and the Uyghur people in Xinjiang was only 4 years. Am I understanding it correctly, Professor Sautman? What does that say about the quality of life in Xinjiang?
Well, you are understanding it correctly. And what it says, I think, about the quality of life in Xinjiang is that the state is very serious about delivering quality health care to ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. And they've become more serious over the years. That delivery of health care can overcome the very large difference in terms of urbanity or rurality that exists between Uygurs and Han people. That is, Uyghurs are about 70% rural. Han people are no more than 30% rural. Everywhere in the world, if you look at life expectancy, there's a big difference between urban people and rural people. In Xinjiang, this creates some particular difficulties because Xinjiang is a huge area, 1/6 of China. And settlements in Xinjiang are often a great distance from each other. So the delivery of healthcare is difficult. And if you talk to doctors in Xinjiang, including, of course, Uyghur doctors, they make this point again and again, that it's hard to provide healthcare in the particular circumstances of Xinjiang. Yet it's been provided to the extent that there is a much smaller gap that exists between Uyghurs and Han than exists between the majority peoples in the countries that you mentioned and minority peoples. And not just in those countries, because since I published that article, I've also looked at other parts of the world where the gaps are even larger. So obviously, the fact that that Uyghurs in Xinjiang are still mostly rural provides an obstacle to closing the gap entirely. But the Chinese government has announced that by the year 2030, it intends to entirely close the gap between Han people and minority people in Xinjiang and have an average life expectancy of 79 years. And of course, that average life expectancy of 79 years would be higher than the life expectancy in the United States.
Yeah. I was going to say that because people would wonder, so you talk about 4-year difference, exactly what are the absolute number? The latest update, it was 79 year, the average life expectancy of Chinese people in general. So the four-year difference would leave the Uyghurs with an average life expectancy of 75 years, which is already pretty good, and that gap is going to shrink. Let's continue to focus on population, but in another aspect, which is population growth. Again, Uyghur population growth has been faster than that of the Han. In your paper, you said, for instance, between 2010 and 2020, which is the last time China had a national census, the Uyghur population grew by over 16%, whereas China's Han ethnic group grew by 4.9%. So Uyghurs actually grew over 3 times as quick. And I'm just quoting the numbers of your research, and we found out the latest number of population for Xinjiang was 26 million in total. Among them, almost 12 million are Uyghurs, making them the largest ethnic group. So it's a lot of numbers, but I hope people get the idea that the growth rate of the Uyghur population far exceeds that of the Han population. Professor Sautman, why do you think the Uyghur population is able to achieve such tremendous growth? And certainly, if you're talking about genocide, the population wouldn't grow, it would decline, right?
Right. Well, of course, every time there's been a genocide, there's been a huge decline in populations. Generally, in the 20th century, big genocides, the ones that are famous in the world, the genocided people diminished on average between 50% and 80%. Yet, as you pointed out, in this period between 2010 and 2020, the rate of growth of the Uyghur population was very substantially higher than the rate of growth of Chinese generally. And I should also point out that in Xinjiang, of course, there's a significant Han population, and its rate of growth during that period from 2010 to 2020 was only about 2.5% compared to the 16.2% for Uyghur people. Now, what's really interesting is what's happened in Xinjiang and in China generally, of course, since 2021, when birth limitations were entirely ended. And what's happened, as far as I can tell, and this is based just on asking officials and demographers in Xinjiang, not on getting data, which unfortunately the government has been reluctant to provide. But by asking them, I have found out that actually the birth rate among Uyghurs has gone up quite substantially since the end limitations. And in Kashgar Prefecture, which is an area of Xinjiang that is overwhelmingly Uyghur, the rate of increase in 2023 was probably somewhere between 10 and 12%.
That's significant.
Not 10 and 12%, but it's 10 or 12 per 1,000 people, which is the way that demographers measure the birth rate.
I see.
So that is a very substantial increase. Recently, a scholar at Tsinghua University, Yan Hairong, an anthropologist who has been doing some field work in rural southern Xinjiang, interviewed an official there who told her that in that locality, actually the rate of increase is now about 30. That is 3% increase, natural increase per year. That is almost certainly the highest rate of increase in the whole of China.
Well, just now you mentioned that some authorities were reluctant to provide numbers. Have you ever guessed what could be possibly the reason why they were reluctant to do that? And secondly, of course, you were getting numbers mostly from Chinese, sources, Chinese scholars. Some people would say, being the devil's advocate, they were giving you only the good numbers, the numbers that make them look good. Have your visits, for instance, in the field, been able to support what you found empirically?
Well, just by observation, I've walked around, of course, in Uyghur neighborhoods. I haven't been able to go to many Uyghur villages because I'm a foreigner. But in terms of urban areas in Xinjiang, if you walk around, you see very many children and many siblings going around together. So that's one indication that the Uyghur population has increased substantially. But actually, I think the reason why the Chinese government has not released data that's disaggregated by ethnicity with regard to population in recent years has to do with part of Chinese political culture. And that part of Chinese political culture is this, that officials are reluctant to tell people things which may be misused. And indeed, in the past, when data was released by the Chinese government, certain people in the West, politicians, media, some scholars, misused the data, misinterpreted the data. So these officials, I think, are reluctant to release the data because they don't want to take the risk that if the data is misused, they will be accused of having released data which could be possibly misinterpreted. Now, I think this is self-defeating, and journalists that I've met in Xinjiang also think it's self-defeating, because if the data is provided, there are people who will not misuse it, who will interpret it in the proper fashion.
Well, I guess this is a learning curve, but that does not mean that, there is dirt under the carpet, that there is serious wrong conduct, that they want to hide something. By the way, the data is available in terms of the number and the growth rate of the Uyghur population, for instance. This is public available. I think it's just the specific breakdown of different ethnicities specifically in that particular region. I found the numbers for the Uyghur population and the Uyghur growth on publicly available websites, by the way. But it's in Chinese, so I don't know whether, how accessible it is for scholars from elsewhere to get these kind of number and use this kind of neighbor. Anyway, shall we move on, because there is a lot of comparison that you mentioned, and here again we're talking about infant mortality again. This is broadly in line with what you just said about the growth of Uyghur population, but shouldn't we move on to maybe the language use, so we're not talking about population again in this very limited period of time. You talked about language use, and you said that, for instance, in the 255 indigenous languages used in the U.S. territory before Europeans arrived, 65 went extinct, 75 nearly extinct today, and only about 2,000 to 400,000 Cherokees, largely Native American group, speak native language fluently, whereas in China, in Xinjiang, for instance, in southern Xinjiang, almost all of the Uyghur people speak their Uyghur language as mother tongue, and in north of Xinjiang, that percentage would be 94%. What is the finding? What does these numbers point to in this regard, Professor Sautman?
I think it points to the fact that there is certainly no effort on the part of the Chinese government or local officials to stamp out Uyghur culture. That is, if you look at the use of the Uyghur mother tongue or the use of other Turkic languages in Xinjiang, they are universally used by people of that ethnicity. It's a very, very high level, generally ranging from 99% to 100%, depending upon the ethnic group in question. And this is very different from the situation that exists in other parts of the world for ethnic minorities and for indigenous people. For example, in the United States, only about 10% of Native Americans can speak a Native American language. Even among Hispanics, which are by far the largest minority ethnic group in the United States, only about 20% of them are fluent speakers of Spanish now. So this means that the situation of protection of minority languages in China is generally quite solid. Of course, one expects that among very small minority groups, especially those groups that live in close proximity to Han populations, gradually they may have their languages diminish naturally by the adoption of the majority language. After all, my mother was an immigrant from Europe. When she arrived in Canada, she couldn't speak a word of English. After 3 weeks, she was fluent in English because she was a child, and children learn languages very quickly. But necessarily, of course, she learned to speak English very fluently, and her mother tongue, because she was speaking English all the time, her mother tongue did diminish somewhat. So this is a natural process that can be expected. But it really hasn't happened in Xinjiang as of yet, and I don't expect that it will happen for generations to come.
What was your mother tongue, by the way, Professor Sautman?
She spoke a kind of dialect of German.
I see, I see. Well, why do you think the Chinese government is putting so much emphasis on helping the ethnic minorities maintain as much as they can, despite the natural, diminishing of the kind of phenomenon that you mentioned? Why do you think it is in the interest of the Chinese government to help maintain the ethnic languages that are used by ethnic minorities, not just in Xinjiang, but in elsewhere as well in China?
Well, for one thing, the ethnic minorities themselves value their languages, and their languages can be bridges to other countries. So, for example, the Turkic languages that are spoken by Uygurs, Kazakhs, Tajiks, etc., in Xinjiang are bridges to the countries of Central Asia. So having fluent speakers of those languages helps in terms of the development of people within Xinjiang. It helps in terms of solidifying the close ties that already exist between Central Asian countries and China, etc. And of course, in terms of the Chinese nation, the Zhuhua Minzu, the contribution of minority cultures has been all along very important. So, of course, language is at the heart of any culture, and preserving that language, those languages, is important in terms of the further development of the Chinese nation.
It is a very fine balance, I find, to strike between preserving diversity, cultural diversity, and the richness of ethnic culture, and giving people, empowering people with the skills of the commonly used language across the country, so that they can enjoy the benefits, they can enjoy the opportunities that comes from the overall development of the country as as an economy, as one big market, let's say. How do you see the balance that's being tried, at least here, to ensure that the children from ethnic minorities not only inherit their heritage language, but they're able to catch on the train towards modernity, as part of the Chinese nation?
Well, one of the things that the Chinese government has done in recent years, of course, is to make Putonghua, Mandarin, to be the language of instruction in all schools, including in minority areas. I know from personal experience that Chinese is not an easy language to learn, especially learning to read and write Chinese. So it takes very intensive study in order to become really fluent in Chinese. But Chinese, Putonghua, is the national language, and therefore It's tied to all kinds of economic opportunities that don't exist for people who are not fluent speakers of that language. And therefore, the Chinese government made the decision to ensure that in minority areas, every minority child learns the national language. At the same time, there are opportunities through the school system to continue to speak, read, and write a minority language.
Finally, Professor Sautman, we don't have the time to go into the other aspects of your research, such as poverty alleviation, but by and large, China is probably the only country in this world that has somehow effectively countered the problem of terrorism, violent extremism, separatism. Although there are still attempts, right, to continue these crimes, but China has been by and large effective, and the effort is an ongoing one. Do you think the West has anything to learn from the Chinese experience, although they will never admit it?
Well, they have a great deal to learn. I mean, the main thing to learn is to address the root causes of terrorism. And of course, the attitude of the West, and this is particularly true of the United States, their attitude is the way that you deal with terrorism is to kill as many people as possible.
After the terrorists have killed, right?
Yeah. So, of course, the result of this is that terrorism remains pervasive in many parts of the world. And all the attempts on the part of Western countries to stamp out terrorism in places like Afghanistan and Iraq had no result other than killing hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. If you look at the effort that China did in Xinjiang with regard to terrorism, actually rather few people were killed in the process. The terrorists killed hundreds of people at least, maybe thousands of people. But in terms of repression against the terrorists themselves, I think it can be said that it was minimal compared to what countries like the United States has done. Rather, China smartly established the vocational educational training center system in Xinjiang, and were able to impart to people in Xinjiang vocational skills, language skills, and knowledge of Chinese law with respect to terrorism and religious extremism and other ills. Mm-hmm. And the result of that was a major contribution, I think, to the alleviation of terrorism in the region.
All right, we have to leave it there. Time was so limited, but it's extremely interesting, Professor Sautman, to read your research and talk to you in person. Thank you so much, Professor.
Pleasure.
Yeah, Professor Barry Sautman, Emeritus Professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and Distinguished Professor at Tsinghua University, joining me from Hong Kong. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Lu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.